justice, business regulation, and peace building. His most recent books develops the idea of restorative diplomacy, John Braithwaite, 2024, Simple Solutions to Complex Catastrophes, Dialectics of Peace, Climate, Finance, and Health. Most of his publications are available for free download from his website, which is johnbraithwaite.com. And once again, thank you very much, Professor John, for giving us a little bit of your time. And the floor is yours. I think you're muted.
Thank you, Vitor. Thank you, Isabella, for your translation. Really appreciate it. I know what hard work that is. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here with Brazilian colleagues. I love Brazil. You have a wonderful university culture, and I look forward to this exchange. Please stop me when I'm going for too long, because you know from the size of this book, it's more useful as a doorstop than as something to really read through. So I could go on and on with it. But its core argument is that freedom is fundamental to building a low crime society, and crime prevention is fundamental to freedom. When crime and domination arrive, they tend to reproduce instances of themselves. So the book interprets crime and domination as cascade phenomena. Domination cascades to more domination. Domination cascades to crime. Crime cascades to domination, and crime, therefore, cascades to more crime. Now, a little bit on what I mean by domination. It means something much wider and deeper than liberal freedom. But liberal freedom of choice is still useful, and the book argues does make a contribution to crime control, including freedom to vote, choice in markets, freedom of movement, etc. They do contribute. But the book argues that Republican freedom as non-domination contributes much more. And so Republican freedom is a thicker form of freedom of the person, which Philip Pettit juxtaposes with freedom of choice. It's freedom from being enslaved or dominated by arbitrary power. In recent decades, inequality, which is at the heart of domination, but the argument of the book is that domination is a more serviceable concept, a more powerfully explanatory and normatively powerful concept than inequality. But nevertheless, inequality of many different kinds is important in the way that it's constitutive of dominations. And inequality has obviously widened profoundly in the social fabric of societies and in global society. For most of human history, the richest societies were only twice as rich as the poorest society. And there were no wealthy business individuals who owned more than the richest kings or more than entire countries, because we have many business leaders in the world today who are richer than the entire GDP of many countries. And those circumstances are likely to drive further declines in trust in institutions and more authoritarian uprisings. So the argument is for simultaneously tempering all forms of domination, discrimination, all forms of discrimination and inequality that drive domination, and that doing so can help suppress crime and prevent civilizational collapse. State-sanctioned discrimination like slavery, apartheid, has historically been the gravest threat to freedom and the worst discrimination for driving both crime and war. A little empirical data here. There's a robust negative relationship between the number of slaves exported from African countries across the Atlantic and the contemporary economic devastation of those African societies. You lose more of your brightest and best to the slave trade in the 19th century and earlier, and you perform worse on the Human Development Index today. And likewise, at the other end of that slave trade transaction, if you look at the systematic data of higher quality in the United States than in any other country, you find that the counties, the US counties, which received the largest numbers of slaves in the 19th century, are the counties with the highest rates of violent crime and indeed other forms of crime today. And the book argues that this is also at the heart of something of great interest to you in Latin America, that Latin America and the Caribbean, according to the argument in the book, is the region of the world with the highest homicide rates compared to other continents. For example, compared to the continent on which I sit in Australia, because of that slave trade. That slave trade is at the heart of the contemporary reality that violence is higher in Latin America and the Caribbean than in the rest of the world, and also that income inequality is higher in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's the long run cycle of relationship between violence and domination across human history. Militarized domination and criminalized domination of governments and markets and gendered domination are particularly destructive forms of domination in the argument of the book. Yet struggles against domination and discrimination do best when they're responsive to those inequalities that happen to be selectively salient at particular times and places. So in some times and places, it will be landlord-peasant inequalities, which will be the most important, or campesino landlord inequalities, which will be the most important ones for explaining wars, civil wars, uprisings, human rights abuses by militaries and militias and death squads and so on. So we've got to be contingently attentive to those particularities of the kinds of inequalities that are, for good reasons, subjectively salient to different peoples at different times. And it's hard to predict which kinds of domination will fuel raging fires of subjective oppression and violence, and which will not. So I argue that societies do well to aim at tempering all kinds of domination. Republican freedom requires richer separations of powers, both public and private, richer separations than we see in Western societies. And I have this, what readers who are not in the Eastern Hemisphere will think is a bit quirky. I'm very attracted to Sun Yat-sen's vision of pluralizing the separation of powers more deeply than in Montesquieu's Western thinking of a light on the Republican, which is a tripartite separation of powers. It draws on ancient Chinese thought about institutions, where the state should be strong. In that Sun Yat-sen view, so should civil society be strong, so should markets be strong, and so should individuals be strong with agency as individuals. So, and that mutual, he doesn't actually use this expression, but it's there in the writing of Sun Yat-sen that mutually constitutive forms of social capital constitute what a lot of contemporary writers refer to as chime, C-H-I-M-E, where chime stands for connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. Chime controls crime, and crime prevention helps to constitute crime as a rich multiplicity of forms of social capital. Okay. The book argues that dominations of the financialization of capitalism must be contested by new financial institutions that can contest, for example, domination by big banks and by the major platform corporations. Domination's deepest threats to freedom and crime occur when commanding heights, institutions, states, markets are criminalized. If the state is criminalized, if the whole system of markets in a society is criminalized, then that society will descend into cascades of many different kinds of oppressions and suffering. Now, the book quite ridiculously has 150 propositions to draw all this out, which I'm not going to oppress you with, but that it really is the way that I think. I'm not so attracted to parsimony as a virtue, because there really are a lot of things, and domination assumes many different forms that must be run down, and power needs to be tempered in many different ways. But nevertheless, I try to be parsimonious by suggesting that I can motivate all 150 propositions with one proposition, which is strengthen freedom to prevent crime to strengthen freedom. So what's distinctive about my work, perhaps, is that it has a particular way of thinking about how to integrate explanatory and normative theory. Explanatory theory is ordered sets of propositions about the way the world is. Normative theory is ordered sets of propositions about the way in which it might be good to change the world. So I view criminology as a dangerous game, that, when we do work in prisons or with the police, with prosecutors, we're playing with fire, because what those institutions do recurrently is oppress and manifest dominations that are untempered dominations. Being a dangerous game, so to be a positivist criminologist that says, oh, well, I'll study algorithms to predict which kinds of individuals which will be most likely to reoffend, that's an example of a particularly dangerous game. Unless we temper that explanatory empirical work with a normative framework about what kinds of criminal justice practices are oppressive, criminology will be a field which is part of the architecture of oppression. And I know you guys have been reading Crime, Shame and Reintegration a bit as well, and that's also behind the thinking there. So the thinking in that book is that shame is important. Shame is also an inevitable part of the oppression of everything that happens in the criminal justice system. So if a police officer arrives at your home and escorts you out the front door of your home into a police car on the street outside, and your neighbor's watching, that's inherently shameful. So there's a shame problem that has to be dealt with as a common form of oppression of the criminal justice. But at the same time, we know that if societies do not find genocide shameful, they will be at risk of genocide. If societies do not find rape or sexual harassment shameful, they will be societies that are at high risk of those forms of domination. So certain kinds of offending that societies like to look away from, corporate crime is another example, and corruption in many societies as well, where there's a general acceptance that corruption is just the way that things work, and we just have to get used to it. That's a very dangerous way of thinking about corruption, because it leads down a slippery slope, I argue, to the criminalization of the state. So I guess that's the way that I would summarize that the work is different from what other people do. But I ought to stop there and let your questions drive the conversation from now on.
That's a powerful capacity of synthesis, considering your book is quite a volume, and I'm quite thankful and for that brief presentation. I think so. Since I'm sort of mediating this, I think I'll start pondering some aspects, and then as people will feel less intimidated with their own English, will then follow with a couple of questions, as it usually happens. And I think one of the great things that I would like to think is bridge the gap between mostly the focus that we had from your original book and this new developments that you've been driving in the last couple of decades. You're a prolific researcher. You publish quite a lot and substantially in a lot of aspects, and I think this is a bridge that we must cross to the contemporary brilliance of John Braithwaite. And so I think my initial questioning is to bring back a little bit to what most of us who are debating your book started with, which is crime, shame, and reintegration. Not specifically the book, but that to the current arguments that you're raising. And I was thinking, as an introduction, one of the things that I would like quite a lot to hear from you, and I think students are quite interested with this, is this: how did you come to this normative aspects, that's as you call it, right? How did you move your research? How did you start with this perspective, which is quite different from mainstream criminology, and even critical criminology, right? Right from the get-go, you were quite capable of joining both critical perspectives and mainstream perspectives to make a whole broad of argument and address that in criminology. And I think crime, shame, reintegration is quite of an achievement in that regard, but also the argument you're bringing in macrocriminology and freedom as well, understanding this huge concepts. So what is the process behind that? Where did you come from to join those traditions and to develop your arguments, as a more general question that I would like to start with? And then it would be very interesting to hear how do you think your development from crime, shame, reintegration to your current work did change. So chime sounds like an interesting new concept here. They're bringing from, let's say, the Southern tradition, how we can call it nowadays, from the international perspective of Asia and so forth. But it also echoes with your past work as well, right? It echoes with the ideas that you're talking about, both the community and interconnectedness. I'm failing to grasp the correct terms. I'm very sorry, but those two that build the whole concept of discussing shame and so forth. And it just feels that, and this is an interesting aspect, it feels that you're driving the discussion, and I don't know if this is true, which you should be focused on shame right now on a bigger aspect of it, which is how this echoes with forms of government, or not necessarily form of government, but forms of domination, forms of systems of governance, let's call it that way. And I think starting from there would be very interesting to hear from you this whole process as well. Thank you very much for this. Also, from your presentation, I was quite curious on how if you could also develop a little bit more on how would you face the challenge of financialization in both aspects that you mentioned, both platform capital and financial capital, which I mean, you're an expert in regulating capital and discussing this issue as a whole. And it sounds specifically in this current context, right? As this platform capitalism and financial capitalism seems very far from the possibilities of actually reaching back to freedom and putting them back to the same level of citizens. They're quite above and regulating our lives beyond our own controls. And I do wonder how can we move forward with our systems of discussion, thinking, and criminology with this situation, which is quite unexpected to see in the following conjecture. Anyhow.
Well, I'll answer your concrete last question first. And, that's where I see the thought of Sun Yat-sen as very useful. I really think it's important to have a fourth branch of governance, which is an integrity and accountability branch of governance, to which institutions like the Electoral Commission answer. So you no longer have an electoral commission which answers and is appointable by the executive government or by the Congress, but it's a fourth elected branch of governance where the members of that branch are small in number, elected for only one term, are required constitutionally not to be members of any political party. They serve one term. They're not beholden to anyone to get re-elected. Someone else will become responsible for the governance of the accountability and integrity. That's the integrity branch. That's the Sun Yat-sen idea that's grounded in earlier ideas that come from ancient Chinese civilization. So the Ombudsman, the Human Rights Commission, certain business regulatory agencies, the central bank, for example, with financialization, are part of that branch, and therefore can't be oppressed by the executive government. I mean, corrupt executive governments tell the head of the central bank to print some banknotes. Print me $2 billion in banknotes so I can, buy this, a chateau in France or whatever. These are things that have actually happened in countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. So, it's very important to overcoming poverty and war in Democratic Republic of Congo to make that constitutionally more difficult for the president to do. Or if you think of platform capitalism, for example, in our own country at the moment, within months, we are going to our government has decided to put in place a ban on access of children under 16 to social media accounts. Now, the government is coming under withering pressure from the 7 major US platform corporations to reverse that policy, and huge geopolitical pressure from the US to not go ahead with that legislation. It would be helpful for the government in resisting that if the administration of that regulation of platform capitalism were accountable to an accountability and integrity branch rather than to the Prime Minister, so that the Prime Minister would be able to say, I'm sorry, my hands are tied. There's a process here. The law was passed through the Parliament. I don't control the Parliament. I'm just the head of the executive government. And that law then is passed on to the accountability and integrity branch for administration with accountability and integrity. That's our more complex separation of powers to make power more effectively tempered for contemporary conditions. So much as I love you, President Trump, much as I would like to respond to your very reasonable request, it's just beyond my power to intervene in the way that you would ask me to do. And I know in your democracy as well, President Trump, you have a separation of powers, which is a different kind of separation of powers. You can't just ride roughshod over yours either, and I don't think you should ask me to try to do something that would amount to a constitutional coup in terms of ours in Australia. So that's, for me, I find the hope there in Sun Yat-sen. And in terms of the theoretical question, I mean, I was always asking myself when I was young the question, John, is a criminologist a good thing to be? Probably not, I would say to myself. These days I say, oh, I'm happy to be considered a criminologist. I'm happy to be considered an interdisciplinary social scientist as well. And I don't really care very much how people think about me or how I think about myself. Crime is a very important topic to focus on. So I think the endeavour that we're all collectively engaged with is a really worthy collective endeavour. But, the criminology project, as I argued earlier, is full of paradoxes. It is a dangerous game, as I argued earlier. Justice shaming is a dangerous game, and it's full of paradoxes. And, before I did Crime, Shame and Reintegration, my first book was Inequality, Crime and Public Policy. So it was going much more directly to the issues in that 2022 book, because it's about the paradox that inequality in a society results in more crimes of the dominated and in more crimes of domination. So it results in a society in which a certain class of people commit crime because they're exploited, and another class of people simultaneously commit different kinds of crime because they have the power to exploit, and because that's unaccountable power, hence the solution of a better architecture of accountability in the state and in civil society and in markets for that matter. That's how I get there. Being troubled by those paradoxes.
That's fascinating, especially the connections here, and I think it echoes quite well with our context here in Latin America. The inequality issue and domination really goes hand by hand, and this is
and in all societies, I think at least I don't know of any that's not true.
Yeah, I think I'll open for the others if they want to chime in with questions and contributions to John. Gabriel, the floor is yours.
Hey, John. First of all, thanks. I'm a graduate student, undergraduate student. So it's a pleasure to be here okay. I'm going straight to my question. So I'm gonna take the main argument that you mentioned, that freedom is essential for small crime, and one thing that at the moment you say that really catch me, that you say freedom is not essential for no crime, or so you say small crime. So my question is, you think that there is still a role for the government, or there's still a role for the state in a policy that still try to use criminalization as a tool? So what I'm trying to say here is in your view now, trying to look for a more normative aspect of it, or in a way that what should be. And what do you think about the abolitionist argument about if there is still a role for crime, for criminalization, and for that type of policy for social constraints? Because I'm always interested when I hear criminologists, and especially critical criminologists, about that argument, that about the abolitionist argument, that so to put more in a more simple way. So you really think that there is still a role for the government, there is still a role for criminalization, and even that freedom is in contradiction with this, crime is in contradiction with the word freedom, in a way that crime is always implies this other world that is prison. So how can you manage to use these two words, freedom and crime, in the same sentence in a way that it's not a contradiction?
Yeah. So I think a simple answer is to say that criminalization of rape helps women to be more free. And I think we can all understand why that might be the case. The state has an important role. It's not the most important role. So with gendered violence, I think state enforcement has against rape, for example, has been much less important in regulation of sexual assault than the rise of the women's movement, and the way that has been successful empirically, in an empirically demonstrable way, in rendering rape more shameful than it was in earlier generations. That I conceive as primarily an accomplishment of a social movement that, we've widely called the women's movement. Feminism. Okay. I'm not an abolitionist also because I spent 10 years as a business regulator part-time. I was a university professor, but I spent 10 years as a part-time commissioner on one of our biggest business regulatory agencies. And of course, I took the idea of restorative justice into the work of the regulator, and many were critical of that. They thought these bad corporate criminals should always be prosecuted, and probably they should have been prosecuted more than they were rather than less than they were, because usually with business regulatory agencies, there's not what I call in the book minimally sufficient deterrence. You don't need a lot of deterrence. You don't need to be sending half of the leadership of your corporations to prison for deterrence of corporate crime to be minimally sufficient deterrence of corporate crime, but maybe you need to send some. So we'd have these restorative justice conferences, and I'm thinking of a particular restorative justice conference in my regulator where we had the NGOs, the civil society movements in the conference saying how badly affected they had been by the behavior of this particular corporation, and they're saying, well, well, this was just one of these things that happens all of the time in business, and all of our competitors do this at times. So we need to keep this in perspective as something that's not, corrupt conduct by our company. Okay, we made a mistake. And in that conference, I intervened and said, gentlemen, because they were all males, the corporate leaders who were making this argument during the conference, that it really wasn't too bad what they were doing. And I made the point, the way we view this as commissioners, gentlemen, is that what we're talking about here is a crime by your company. We're not talking about just a mistake. We're talking about these representatives of NGOs who say that their members have been victims of your corporate conduct, that they are victims of crime, and if we can not come up with a satisfactory resolution that heals the hurts of those consumers, then we should prosecute you criminally for your conduct. That's the way we think about it. So that's John being an anti-abolitionist, if you will. So that's my sort of personal history, where I would find it very difficult. I think in a context like that, the criminal label does useful work in saying, no, this is something a bit more serious than corporate mistakes. Just as when we describe something as a war crime or a crime against humanity, we're talking about something that's a bit more serious than just an accident in the fog of war. Or if we say that this is genocide, as in the UN report yesterday, this is saying something more serious again, which creates obligations of all states, on all states, to speak up and say, this must stop, because all states have an obligation under international law to speak up against something so serious as to be defined as genocide. So I think genocide's a problematic concept, but it can do useful work, as we saw it do yesterday in the case of Gaza.
Fascinating, yeah, absolutely. There's a question in the chat that I'd like to address to you. I think it follows from Gabriel's lead there, but in another way. The question asks, could you share your thoughts on the current aggravated political instrumentalization of fear of crime as a means to govern and control? How could we put a stop to it?
Yeah, I do think that is a problem in many, if not most, societies. And I guess that's a place where a very old-fashioned kind of non-critical criminology proves to be rather useful in, more conservative criminologists, if you like, taking responsibility for that debate and saying, no, well, actually the rate of property crime, and you're just talking about property crime here, is down in the last 3 years. There's less stealing of cars happening in our country than was happening 20, 30 years ago, which is the case in many societies, of course. That's a reason for young John to think, well, go with the flow. And people say you're a criminologist. If someone on the media wants to interview you about a moral panic of fear of crime, which is based on a misplaced empirical interpretation of the state of crime in my society, I should go on TV and under the label criminologist and say, well, actually the homicide rate is down in Australia. it's reasonable for us to be afraid of being murdered, but actually we should be less afraid than our parents and our grandparents were, or whatever it is. Yeah. Criminology has its old-fashioned criminology has some very important uses there, I think.
Yeah, I think you make a compelling case, especially in many of your books there, that we shouldn't just ignore that. Actually, there are many lessons to be drawn from those traditions as well. So there's another question here in the chat. So it's a complex question and it's in Portuguese, so I have to see how make this work. Let me just read it first so I can translate it, because it develops a little bit. Okay. So this is a question, I think, that connects social media behavior patterns and new technologies with your main argument about shame and so forth. So the main question is that Beatriz is making this a very interesting question, I think, which is the argument is that shame is an important part and also an important part of the oppression system. So it goes both ways. But if society doesn't find genocide or rape that's shameful, then there's a problem, right? And she goes about, well, this insight should be coupled with the contemporary uses of new technologies, social medias, and so forth, in which there's this extreme meaning of reality and shame in contemporary society. We're just talking about platform capitalism and how can they even profit from this? But it's not only about the profit, I believe, the question, but this connection to it. And she'd like to hear a bit from you in that regard.
Yeah, well, social media communication is very dangerous in terms of the theory in crime, shame, and reintegration, because the reintegration part is so much more difficult on social media. We're relational animals, human beings, who resolve our differences when we resolve them well by looking each other in the eye, even giving each other a hug after a bitter and angry disagreement if we're members of the same family, for example. But that's obviously something that does not happen on social media. All of these shameful communications are done at a distance, without interactive listening, without deep listening, with just listening to grabs rather than listening to the great humanness of meaningful relational interactions. So, that is the difficulty. That is part of the Australian government's arguments to say we need to be more protective of children from that. We need to educate our children by the time they're 16 to be ready to resist the enormous pressures that come from shaming on social media. But obviously it does great harm, because social media conduces to stigmatization. The algorithms are designed to engender stigmatization. They're designed to find out who are the people we dislike most, who make us most angry, and to feed us angry messages back at those people who we dislike, whether they're Palestinian people or Jewish people, for example. Depends on who we are, what kind of angry, stigmatizing, shaming messages we get about the crimes that have been committed on both sides of that of that terrible conflict. So we do have a big challenge ahead of us there. We do have to learn how to rehumanize our lives so we do more deep listening to others. I think schools have an important place here. If you have a school in which there are some Jewish students and perhaps some Palestinian refugees, but certainly some Muslim immigrants who have come to a wealthy Christian society, for example, to have conversations in the classroom when we're dealing with the history of that region of the world, as most schools do, because the Middle East is the land of the book. It's the birthplace of the most widely practiced religions around the world. So everyone at school learns a bit of that history of what in Christian countries is sometimes called the Holy Lands, but not just our Holy Land, not just our Christian Holy Land. So it's good for schools when there's conflict in classrooms to actually talk through those issues and listen to the different perspectives of different children on what they're worried about, that they're seeing on television or that they've been exposed to in social media. So we've got to think about how we're going to reconnect, particularly children, to a more relational way of living. I'd say a more restorative way of living. Restorative justice is not just a technology for how to resolve disputes, though restorative circles in schools are very useful in educational practice, in my view. But restorative justice as a way of living, as a way of being in the world, so we do not stigmatize others. However, for example, genocidal, we view the behavior of a particular military, that we do not stigmatize the people of that country, that we do not boo Russian tennis players because they're Russians and because a war is going on in Ukraine, and we perhaps don't like the way that the Russian military is behaving in that war. So it comes down to parents being engaged in conversations, I think, and schools and universities too.
Most definitely. There's a question in the chat, but before addressing it, maybe someone has anything here, or I'll give a couple of seconds before going to the chat again. Otherwise, or just the chat will monopolize any meaningful conversation from social animals. The chat wins, I think, for now.
Can I say something about shaming and minor forms of misconduct? I mean, I think maybe the book says this somewhere, but there's a lot of evidence about parenting that goes like this. In more than the first year of the life of children, the best policy is unconditional love, no matter how naughty the behavior of that child is. But by the time a child reaches age 2, it does improve the quality of the learning of the child of how to be a relational citizen in the society, for gentle forms of shame to be communicated. And the gentle form of shame I describe there is, so a toddler, a little child, is tugging at his mother, and he's trying to interrupt a conversation that his mother is having. And for more than the first year of life, what the mother is best to do is not worry about that, pick up the child, give the child a cuddle and move on. But if the child is over 2, it can be appropriate for the mother to say, now, I'm talking to Jamie's mother at the moment, so let me finish hearing what Jamie's mother is saying to me, and then you can have a chance to speak. So it's a gentle form of disapproval of my child learning that you need to take turns in conversation if you're to learn how to be a listening citizen of our society. We have to give you a bit of disapproval when you interrupt and think it's always your turn to speak and never been told to wait with your intervention into the conversation. So that form of gentle shaming has a role in even very minor infractions like interruptions in conversations. So it's not just that shaming, I think, is something that's important for sexual assault or genocide. I think it's important for a lot of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I also believe that that's one of your strengths in your theory is the capacity to move from that whole spectrum, which is quite a fascinating take overall, if I may say. Violeta has joined the crew to give the social contact that we animals so much crave. Violeta.
Hello, I'm gonna try to be quick because I'm in a kind of a noisy place. So I don't know if someone's gonna interrupt me in the middle. I'm at school actually. But I'd like to ask you, because many sociologists, I think Western sociologists and thinkers, they seem to understand this kind of scission between the state and the family. It's like the state will break the family's continuation to start a new thing. So we seem to see that in many philosophers. We seem to have this kind of concept. And I'd like to understand, how can we get over this classical split between the state and the family to understand how the state can bring in some of the reintegrative shame structures that you mentioned on your text? And for example, I'd like to understand a bit more about how this was made in Japan, and how can we extract some of the knowledge that was produced in Japan to other countries without, I don't know, failing into the cultural Japanese specific aspects. Thank you very much.
That's a good question. Thanks, Violeta. Quite a hard one to answer, really. I mean, the easiest way I'll take the easy way of answering it is to say what we should not do on these things is say, well, we need to make the state very strong to control the abuses of families, and families are patriarchal, for example, it might be argued, so we should weaken families. And I also think it's not the appropriate response to say that because the state is dominating families in certain contexts, we should weaken the state. What we need is a society with strong states, strong families, and strong individuals within the family. So the strong individuals within the families are able to resist oppression from within the family and also oppression from the state. And strong families are able to rally and resist oppressive state practices in areas like child protection, where the state inappropriately takes a child away from their mother because their mother is poor and, not keeping a tidy house or something ridiculous like that as a reason for the state to intervene in the family. So it's the it's the contestation between what we want is the power of all of those institutions and individuals being able to temper domination by the other. And if we allow any to become too weak, for example, if the mother in the example earlier doesn't bother to educate their child not to interrupt, that child will spend their whole life being dominated by others, because other people will say, get lost, you don't listen to us, get lost, we don't want nothing to do with you. And that child will be disempowered in the society unless they learn how to be polite in conversation. So, relational work is fundamental to these issues, and the fundamental mistake to avoid it. It's the same with debates between, socialists saying we want to weaken markets and capitalists saying we want to weaken the state so markets can be strong. In important ways, we want markets to be strong. We want investment to flow to Brazil so jobs can be created in Brazil. But we want the Brazilian state to be strong so it can regulate effectively abuses of those markets by domineering corporations that might be dominating from other countries with platform capitalism, for example. And so if Brazil moves to tax transactions or advertising revenue of the platforms, as I would submit is a good policy to do that, then it should have the capability to resist those who say, we are going to punish the Brazilian state if it dares to tax the advertising revenue that Facebook or Google receives. That got us a bit away from families, but can I pass back to you to tell me where I failed to grapple with your difficult question?
I think it was a very satisfying answer, but in a way, I believe that my question is more of how can we get through the seizure between family and state, and how can we, I don't know, grab examples from the Japanese experience to other countries, thinking of how the state was capable of introducing this reintegrative shaming, not exactly reintegrative shaming, but I believe like this community engaging in the prevention of crime and, well, the post-crime also. So something like that.
I think human beings are storytelling animals. So we can all be empowered by telling stories that we think are instructive. So if we see from our own family or from someone else's family a story of inspiring intervention by families to assert their rights. I often tell stories about restorative justice. I'll tell you a real story very quickly about a restorative justice conference in my hometown where a child had committed a minor crime, theft, admitted to the offence. The police officer in the restorative justice conference said, did this. And the young person said, I apologize. I will pay the shopkeeper back for the things that I stole from her shop. And I'm really sorry I did this. And I'm sorry to my family, to my parents, for really upsetting them about the police coming around to talk to them about what I did. And I'm going to try to put this right. So well, that all goes well. And then the mother says, well, I'm very proud of my son today, that he has taken responsibility for what happened, but we have not spoken about the most important injustice that occurred in this incident. And that important injustice was that you, Constable Smith, in arresting my son used excessive violence about my son and actually caused my son's lip to bleed and punched him on the nose. And that is no way to respond to a child in arresting a child. So that's that assault of you, Constable, on my son. And I would like this to be reported from the Restorative Justice Conference to your police commander to be discussed as to how you can learn to behave more appropriately with children. That leads to an apology by the constable and an inquiry, which, sort of a disciplinary hearing against the constable. So that's a very empowering story for me, about families, empowering them, speaking up. And it's usually mothers who do that in restorative justice conferences, by the way. It's one of the interesting empirical differences in our research in Canberra, that in court, mothers almost never speak, but in restorative justice conferences, mothers of the offender are the individuals who get most airtime during the conference, because they want to assert themselves on behalf of their child. It's a very interesting empirical result. But we tell stories about this, and the stories energize people about some things we can do as ordinary citizens to rein in abuses of power by the criminal justice system.
Very interesting. There's a question in the chat that I think was not originally to be connected with this, was a little bit before this question, but I think it ended up actually following from your answer there, John, which is how do you view the absence of a gender perspective in criminology research? Do you think this affects the understanding of the issues in general in criminology being studied?
Well, I think it's changing for the good a lot. I taught at University of Maryland in 2022, which is, the most highly ranked criminology graduate program in the United States. And the intake of graduate students in the year in which I was teaching there was 11 females and 1 male. And so this is the hardest graduate program to get into. So, for me, as an old male criminologist, it's amazing, because criminology used to be a boys' field. It's about boys' toys like guns and police and locking people up and violence, all of these things that boys are interested in. But now we have a world where most of the students sitting in our, is this true of Brazil, that most of the students sitting in your criminology classes are young women?
I wouldn't know for sure.
I would say it's half. Yeah, it's pretty much yeah.
But it wouldn't have been 20 years ago, I assume. It would have been
in the UK. Most postgraduate students in the UK in the masters of PG were women as well. This was a general trend.
Big change from when I was young. So I
would say this, John, the better ones are women.
And I do think feminist criminology has been a growth field. There's more and more feminist criminology being published in the criminology journals compared to the last century. So there's hope. There's hope there. Not solving the problems which feminist criminology addresses, but hope that criminology as a field is making a better contribution to it.
Yeah, I think we're closing to the end. I think I don't know how you feel, John, but I think one or maybe two questions would fit well with your generous time so far. So I have there's some questions in the chat as well, but I don't know if before that someone wants to address something or ask and use the opportunity as well. The one in the chat actually just was following up from Violeta in your interaction. Actually, that was quite an interesting aspect here. We're asking, how do you feel this family issue with the state, and that some feminists see the family as a power mechanism of the state, and if you feel that there's a way out of that, sort of working as a state mechanism, and if that way out is the school, or maybe if I can add to that question, which is not the question itself, maybe even restorative justice as a mediating space between those two institutions.
It can be, and a lot of families are patriarchal and state dominating and church dominating and so on, but they don't have to be, of course. Families also can be liberating institutions, just as schools can be one or the other, depending on whether the culture and politics of the school and the family is one that cultivates freedom, liberation rather than domination.
John, if I may, I have just I make a joke in my classes about homeschooling, because you're talking about education, etc., and the importance of being educated outside your house, and just having the input of society. And I say that I'm not against homeschooling as long as you don't let your child leave the house. I mean, the idea of that we have enough as to try to bring the universe in our kids, and it is very hard. I have two little kids, and trying to educate them in sense of bringing young young men to the world that are free and understand liberty because they have limits, and define those limits in a very democratic way, listening to them, but establishing the conditions of participating in the decisions of family in different levels. But I think that we have to agree that, well, we are not prepared for that. The state doesn't give us any kind. I don't want instructions from the state, but I do need some kind of counseling. And if you see in Brazil nowadays, you don't have nowhere to look for and ask for this kind of help. And it's for me that I'm wealthy. I'm in the upper class in Brazil. But if you think in poor people that have to work every day and just are coming back home just absolutely stressed and fatigued, and then they have and how they're going to push that limits and establish those boundaries. I mean, we have to think about the participation of the state in bringing our children in this kind of education, to break this idea of dominance. And there's so much to do in this area. And we as criminologists, we don't bring this thing up, right? I mean, I think that your work, even though it's been written a while ago, but I'm not aware of many other works that deal with this concern of yours in much as a detail and as you bring it up. So how do you feel about, do you feel that your contributions, do you have any kind of disciples or other kind of just contemporaries or new readers or professors that are working in the same direction as you established in your book?
Oh, I think many who are working in better directions than me. I mean, I think of Jennifer Llewellyn in Dalhousie University in Canada, where they have a province-wide restorative justice movement that's dealt with problems like sexual harassment in their university, in child protection, in Human Rights Commission on human rights abuses. So, when you have that kind of architecture that I think is rather richer in that part of the world, in Eastern Canada, you have this possibility that children better learn how to participate in families. And if they don't, they better learn how to participate in schools, in decision-making, democratic decision-making. And if that doesn't happen there and they end up in the child protection system, you have child protection system that is relational and listens to what the children have to say and gives children genuine voice in what the outcome will be.
Thank you.
I would like to, I think, I'd like to give the privilege of asking the last question here to John and close this with the generous time that you have given us with this question. And it's a more broad one than a conceptual one. I feel that your trajectory so far has been very optimistic. I mean, this is an impression from reading your books. You deal with very hard issues. I mean, corporate regulations on tough stuff they do, on harsh situations of crime, genocide. I mean, these are really raw realities of humanity in itself. Nevertheless, it does feel that you always come around with an optimistic view of change. And I'd like to hear from you if you do feel optimistic about change, if you do feel that we can address it in a different way, and if criminology should embrace more this optimism for change and maybe draw that to a final note.
Yeah, I am generally regarded as pathologically optimistic, but and I do talk about corporate criminals and war criminals who I've genuinely liked as people, and that's pointed to as evidence of my pathological optimism. But I don't know that I should commend that to others. We have to be ourselves. It's very important that we don't shame ourselves in inappropriate way for being the people we are, and we just accept who we are and the kind of way of living in the world that we choose to live, and others can make fun of us for being pathologically optimistic, and that's fine, and perhaps they're right. But there is all this evidence that if people who are unrealistically optimistic about certain important things in their life are less likely to be depressed. And people who are realistic about, whether their education is worthwhile and looking at the limited relevance of their education for saying, getting them the kind of job they want to get when that's what's important to them. That's an example of being realistic about something in your life. If you're overly realistic like that, you're more likely to be a depressed person. Unfortunately, that's what the psychological. So there's something to be said for erring on the side of optimism, but I wouldn't push that too hard. We should all be who we naturally are.
Yeah, there's this famous assertion of the being having the optimism of the will, which Gramsci once said, despite being pessimistic about the circumstances. But I think with that all, it's been a great meeting with you. We managed to address your current thought, your background, the specific issues, and you've given us so much time to ask all the specific questions and annoy you with all this. And for us, it's been a great moment and a great chance to cross the Atlantic right now. So I think I speak on behalf of all that we're very grateful for your time, for your patience with us, and hopefully this is just the beginning of a future of contacts and talks that we can develop one day, perhaps stronger. It was truly inspiring and a very good moment for us all. Thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you for the wonderful quality of your questions. And if we didn't get to anything that you really wanted to ask, feel free to send me an email and I'll do my best to quickly answer them. Okay, thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.